Good morning. So today we are going to talk about best practices for data migration and historical project data retention. It's quite a long title. That will become very clear later on why we chose that one. Just a little bit of an introduction and a little bit of housekeeping from myself. So I am your speaker today. My name is Andy Carter. I'm one of the senior PPM consultants and also functional team lead here at CPS. My background, I've been in the IT working space for 20 odd years, and that's a bit of a younger picture of myself before all the grey hair. My background is primarily, I started off in infrastructure, and as many people transitioned into the world of projects. So I've spent the last probably 12 years or so working in the project space before I decided actually what a better way to solve some of the challenges today than actually come and work on a solution for project managers that have those challenges. So I moved to CPS a couple of years ago, and here I am now. Today we're going to cover off a couple or some agenda items. So they are mainly one, understanding data migration, and we are going to fundamentally look at this from a project perspective, strategies for that successful data migration, whether you need to leverage automation and tools for data migration, ensuring that kind of data retention and compliance, but then also future-proofing yourself for your data strategy. So let's talk about data migration. Now, data migration itself, effectively, we want to manage data. One must comprehend those kind of principles of data migration. This segment will basically introduce the concept of data migration, its significance and the key phases involved, and the common challenges that may arise. So, data migration is a critical process that involves transferring data between different storage systems, formats, or platforms while maintaining that data integrity and accuracy. This is often necessary during technology upgrades, and in most cases, this is to improve system performance, scalability, and security. Security is a massive side now that happens where suppliers will cease support, cease functionality, or security updates. So therefore, the trajectory is to move on to newer and more cloud-based platforms. By migrating data effectively, organizations can optimize how data is accessed and managed, which in turn streamlines those kind of operational workflows and boosts, on the high occasions, overall efficiencies. Additionally, ensuring that the data remains available and reliable throughout the migration process, it's vital for supporting those informed decision making. So fundamentally, it's usually down to technology upgrades that we need to do data migrations. Although we are talking about projects today, this process pretty much is seamless across any kind of SaaS or any other data migration. So the key phases in data migration process, and I'll be honest, a lot of these sometimes get forgotten, but the data migration process typically involves several phases, which is planning, data mapping, that data extraction, that transformation and loading, and the validation. Each phase is critical for ensuring data integrity and successfulness. A lot of the time, data migration can be overlooked as businesses focus on the new tooling requirements and those exciting new features. We all want to chase that new, exciting tool that's going to streamline our workflow. But what generally happens is a lot of the times people forget about how they get their current data into the platform, or they may believe at that particular moment in time, they don't foresee the need to migrate that data. Now, sometimes that is very short-sighted because we find quite often working with our various customers and clients that we generally have to probe that conversation. So sometimes people haven't really thought about how they take their current data and transform it. Some, like I mentioned, may even deem it not necessary, but then, like I said, later realize that that legacy data is key, and trying to dual run two platforms can only be tedious, but also not cost effective. So some of the common challenges and pitfalls. Now, don't be alarmed. I have put data loss at the very top. Data loss in migrations is not as common these days as it used to be. However, we always should, particularly if you ever work in the project space, be risk averse. So understanding mitigation factors that you can put into place to prevent that kind of data loss is again key. So we always should plan for that worst case scenario. So this is why taking cautious approach is advised. Having a good backup strategy before that data migration is a key aspect. That way data loss can be avoided, but it also prevents us from data corruption. Now, generally those will work when you're looking at tool-based systems. Obviously, if you're manually migrating data, the chances of actually losing data or having data corruption on a manual process is very benign. It's not something that you necessarily see, but it's just something, again, to be aware of. Integration issues will usually occur when the migration is an afterthought rather than a key deliverable. So as part of a new platform is preparing for every eventuality. So having that data migration is key. And like I said, generally what happens is people will believe that at the very earliest that they can potentially dual run systems or dual run platforms, and later go on and find that it's not cost effective because budget owners or actually just the process of trying to dual run systems can become very tedious and very challenging. Looking at metadata, which is a very key aspect to look at. Although the data mapping process happens and you can have a look at the entities, so from one entity will map to another, one of the biggest key common areas that we generally see problems with is although the data entities are mapped, that misaligned metadata is usually the biggest challenge. Now that will usually come from the attributes of that metadata. So rather the fact that you're looking at text, for example, let's say we take a string, so we might be looking at the project name, for example. You may have one system that has a character limit of 100 characters, and the new system, let's say, for example, if not configured correctly, may have only a 50 character limit. So again, this is something that we see quite often when people try to automate the platform, or even if they're doing it manually, if there is a misalignment between those metadatas and the attributes of those character sets, for example, and that's just one example, that is where we see those kind of common pitfalls occur. Now, obviously, if you're utilizing something like tooling, you will get reports, you will get that kind of overview of why stuff has failed. And we'll talk about tooling a bit later, but that's one of the key reasons that misaligning data is a key challenge, and it is a common pitfall that a lot of people fall into. So let's have a look at implementing a strategy. So strategies with data migration are key, and they are probably as key as the project itself. So if you're moving to a new platform, the approach that you take to this kind of migration, including whether it's the couple of approaches we'll look at today is a phase and a big bang. How do we go about choosing the right one? Because there is no simple singular answer for both. So a couple to look at, and we'll cover those right now, is a phased approach, a big bang, and then we'll talk about those advantages and disadvantages of each. So the phased approach involves transferring data in stages, while the big bang approach involves migrating all data at once. So each has its advantages and disadvantages depending upon your organizational needs. So if we look at phase, for example, some of the pros for it are that you've got reduced risk. So migrating data in stages minimizes that kind of risk of data loss or corruption, but it also enables you to thoroughly test that migration. So rather than just doing like a big bang when you chuck it in over a weekend or over one evening, for example, you can do a pilot to that data migration to make sure what you're chewing out one end is what you're expecting to see on the other. It also enables that operational continuity. So this approach allows for like the ongoing operation with minimal disruption, albeit there has to be some plans around that. So because if you're running two platforms simultaneously, it will be about which projects have moved from what platform to the other and how you manage that user and that communication expectation. So there are some other challenges associated with that, and that's around the kind of communication. From a flexibility standpoint, it provides the ability to make the adjustments based on your feedback. So if you find, like for example, I mentioned earlier, that metadata was incorrectly aligned, you have that opportunity to go and fix that. So again, from a flexibility standpoint, from a feedback loop, it is always good. Generally what we tend to see people do is they'll do like a hybrid of these two. So they'll do a phase to kind of do the testing and the pilot to make sure everything works, and then they'll go with a larger big bang or larger sections of phased approaches. So one of the biggest cons with the phased approach is the longer duration it takes. It really depends on obviously the amount of projects, say for example, that you're looking to use. We've worked with clients that have exported along the lines of 2,000 or 3,000 projects to some that have only done 20. So again, depending upon that approach, the duration can be massively extended if you're utilizing, a larger number of project subsets, that you're obviously then pushing out that kind of timeline on the dual running operational costs of the two platforms. The complexity, like I mentioned earlier, is one of the biggest challenges is around that complexity of managing users of the platform. How you communicate that is key. If you're obviously utilizing one platform, we use Project Online as an example here, and you're migrating to, say, Microsoft Planner, that approach would obviously have to be the fact of, if you're migrating certain assets or projects at that particular time, that the communication around those project managers and the owners of those projects and that metadata is made clear and everybody understands the roadmap. And obviously roadmaps change, so keeping that communication again is a key consideration. There is a potential for inconsistencies as well. And that is generally between the old and new system, because generally what will happen is if you're moving to a new system, again, like I mentioned, you're moving to new and more advanced and exciting features that are really great to show your stakeholders, your project managers, your users. But one of the biggest challenges you'll have then is the inconsistencies between the two. We often find when people want to go down this phased approach, what generally happens is you'll get people at the very back end of this phased approach schedule that will want to be brought forward because they actually want to use some of the features in the new platform because it's more efficient and more viable for them to use as a PPM solution. So that's just some of the cons for the phased approach. Now the big bang, I've seen this done a couple of times. I will talk about a couple of case studies where they've used both of these. But one of the biggest pros for a big bang is obviously the speed. So we can do a migration. All that data is migrated at once. Fantastic. It's great. It's in the new platform. This can obviously be beneficial from an organizational standpoint, because if you've got tight deadlines or you're looking at minimizing that duration of that migration project, or actually the use case of dual running costs or operational costs of running two systems, from a speed and efficiency point of view, it's absolutely amazing. It obviously gives you that immediate transition, so you can immediately move on to the new system. It can be advantageous to clients or organizations who basically want to quickly leverage those new benefits of the new system, like I mentioned. So you've got some simple new technology that you can use from day one. From a management perspective as well, it's a lot easier to manage. So if I was running this as a project and I was doing a big bang approach, for me, it'd be great because I know from, say, tomorrow, all of this project would be online in my new platform. But from what would keep me up at night, I know if I was migrating it this evening, that would be a big concern on my view. So that's when we'd probably look at doing that kind of initial pilot to understand it. And that's why I said there are some hybrid versions of these two. From a cons point, like I mentioned, there is a higher risk. So migrating all data at once carries a massive risk. So if we have significant issues, such as, like I mentioned, data loss, it's very rare now, more likely data corruption, that can have a substantial impact on those kind of operations. Now, a mitigating factor in there is, like I mentioned, keeping backups and using something like a 3-2-1 strategy in your backups, so having it in 3 different places and somewhere like on the cloud that can be restored very quickly mitigates a lot of those. You do have operational disruption. Now, the big bang approach, I generally see a lot of clients who've never been through this process before, ever done like large migrations. And, I've done them in the past from moving from an on-prem infrastructure to the cloud. And a lot of senior stakeholders that aren't so tech aware may think, oh, the amazing way to do this is to just do it over a weekend because it's not going to impact our users at all. But you think of those guys that have to support that and how that goes through. If you have a problem at the weekend with your data migration, how does that play out into the business? So that is one of the biggest considerations. So If anybody ever looks to do a big bang approach, we generally would recommend you don't do it at weekend. It may seem advantageous to do it then because your users aren't in and working, but from a support perspective, sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to manage. And obviously then you've also got that limited flexibility. So once we've done it, in theory, if it's worked, we're in, we're in the new platform, we're off and running. Most people will not delete the old platform at that point. They would maintain that platform for a period of time just to do some final checks and balances. But there may be some scenarios, and I have seen this in the past in a previous workplace, where they basically shut off the old platform 2 days after because the license was up for renewal and they wanted to basically not have dual operational costs. So sometimes there are those challenges as well that will force you down that kind of big bang approach, which is just something to be aware of. So choosing the right strategy. When selecting your migration strategy, it's really essential to understand and elevate those critical factors that are important to you. So first, consider the complexity of the data involved. So like I mentioned earlier, there was a few examples I gave where there was people with 2,000 plus projects and some with only 20 or 30 projects. This will massively impact how smoothly that migration can proceed and what tools or method are best suited. If you've obviously only got 20 or 30 projects, you may look at the manual process of doing that, and that would probably be an absolutely fine and efficient way to do it. But obviously then time constraints can also play a significant role. Some strategies may be faster but riskier, like the big bang approach, while others are more thorough, thought through, but will certainly take a lot longer. The other key thing is also assess the amount of resources you've got available. Somebody has got to do this. So whether you're doing it manually, whether you're doing it with tooling, there are still people involved in that process. So making sure the right resources are available, including those personnel, technology, and also your budget. That's a key thing. A lot of people, and we'll talk about this a bit later, generally go for the manual approach because they see tooling as an expensive commodity, where really if they did a cost impact analysis between the two, they'd probably find the tooling was a lot more cost effective in the long run. So doing a comprehensive assessment of your project requirements, because this is a project, helps clarify these factors and ensures whatever approach you choose aligns with your organisation broader goals. And that's the key thing. Not everybody's right. I can't sit here and tell you which is the best solution to go with, because without knowing your individual circumstances, that differs quite dramatically. But this decision-making process should be very deliberate. It should be tailored and designed specifically for your needs. So making sure you're balancing that kind of efficiency, the risk and the resource allocation you've got available to yourself. So let's have a look at a couple of case studies. Now, I'm not going to mention the companies. Now, they have both worked with us at CPS. So I am going to refer to them as Organisation A and Organisation B. Let's talk about Organisation A. So Organisation A had quite a large number of projects. There were about 800 projects in total. What they decided to do, though, was deem everything prior to 2023 as what they would call legacy projects. So they were like historic projects they needed to report on. They also needed to maintain them for regulation point of view. And we'll talk a little bit more about data regulations and retention later. But they needed to maintain those 500 that they didn't migrate. They went through the process of migrating 300 projects, and the approach that they took was basically to draw a line in the sand. So they had a point in time, which was anything prior to 2023, would stay in the old platform. Now, when I mean they stayed in the old platform, their old platform was something that they didn't have additional cost to. It may not surprise you to hear, a lot of individuals will certainly have come across this. They were using the likes of Excel and SharePoint to manage their projects. It's quite common, unfortunately, and it's why I joined CPS to help change that. But for them, obviously, the dual operational costs for that were quite simple to swallow because they were already getting the likes of Excel and SharePoint as part of their E5 licensing. So from that perspective, there was no costs. What they had us work on was just basically to help us put that in a place that could be maintained. It was put into a read-only and archive state, but could still be reported on with the likes of Power BI, for example. Now, the 300 projects they then migrated, they went through an approach of having a phased approach. Now, with a lot of migrations, what generally happens is your first phase is quite simple. So you'll start with a smaller number, so that's like your initial pilot phase. And then as time gone on, when their confidence grew in the tooling that they use tooling to do this, the numbers pretty much expedited themselves fairly quickly. And we actually migrated a full 300 projects in under a week. So the original plan was to migrate around 10 on day one. We had a break to assess. We then migrated another set of projects. I think it was about 100 the following time. We then assessed, and then finally, when they were happy and they'd seen no errors in any of that data, we migrated the remaining. And that worked really successfully. Some of the challenges we did appear to come across on there, again, related to some of that data mapping. So not so much around the entity type itself, but again, some of the constraints around stuff. When you're coming from the likes of SharePoint, for example, some of the links included in there when you're using shareable links are quite excessive. So when you're utilizing URLs, for example, making sure the new platform can adhere to a 500 character string is critical. But it's again quite easy to solve. Now, case study 2, so organisation B only had 40 projects. So in this case, this is where you start to think about approaches. They did think about going down the manual approach. I would always recommend people steer away from that. Unless you're migrating 10 projects, it's quite a dangerous game to play doing it manually from a lot of perspectives, and we'll touch on that a bit later. But generally, a lot of the problems with doing stuff manually is it can be very resource intensive too. It's also very prime for not so much data loss, but also if you think about data handling practices, if you're utilizing stuff like PII in some of your projects, which can happen, some of you may work in the public sector, etc., you are governed by a lot of regulations where you necessarily won't have people having that access to that data that should be there. So that's something to just bear in mind. But this big bang approach, they migrated 40 projects. It absolutely worked. From their perspective, they did use a tool. Again, it was just done in one hit. We had full confidence on it. It was actually a more simplified approach. They were quite low in their maturity on project management, this organization. So they kind of come from using another third-party system into what was Project for the Web now. Then it's now Planner, or will be Planner from the 1st of August. And that worked really well. So for them, because it was quite a low risk, they went through that process of doing it in one big bang. But the beauty of it is that we insisted that they took that back up at the initial stage. So if there was any problems, it was very easy for them to roll back. Now, one of the big things with these, as I mentioned it earlier, that these had a deadline to hit, and their deadline was at the end of that particular month. Their license for that product run out, and they didn't want to renew it because, like a lot of organizations, they will not want to cater for you renewing for 1 month. They will look to lock you in for a 12 or 24-month contract. So that's one of the key things to consider. But both of them on both of these occasions worked really well. I have been on the receiving end of bad migrations. So one of my previous roles, I worked as an IT manager, and I had a third party manage some of our data once, and they went for a big bang approach, and that didn't go so well. So it's just something to bear in mind when you go through this approach, is to really understand what you're signing up to, how that approach would impact you, and also think about that recovery time. So if something was to happen, how are you best served to kind of go through this approach? So I said we talk about tooling. And this is quite important. Now, I'm not going to try and give you a hard sell on tooling. I'm not a salesperson or consultant. My idea is to basically talk about the best approaches to anything. A lot of the times I generally hear when people look at tooling for doing stuff like migrations or automation, years ago, people used to be like, no, I don't want to spend that. I can absolutely get some of my staff to do that, and they will do it for me very efficiently without a minimum fuss. And I know it'll be right because I'll get people check it. The reality is with tooling these days, is from a streamlined kind of migration perspective, this is by far the most cost effective and most simplified way of doing any kind of data migration. Now, like I said, it does present some challenges. One is obviously there is some initial CapEx costs at the beginning of this. But realistically, they generally outweigh the operational costs that we find. So when people go and buy a tooling, to do that data migration. If you were to do a cost-benefit analysis of the two, you would often find that actually purchasing that tool would be a lot cheaper of a commodity than actually getting somebody to do that manually. Now, the main reason is around one, it simplifies. You're not relying on people to do it. People generally have day jobs as well, so actually finding the time to go through that migration step is difficult, but also from a perspective of errors. Now, this is very, very simple to do. We are all human. Actually, human error is around 4%. And generally what happens is when you're doing data migration, I think of any of those poor people that have ever worked in data entry. Thankfully, I've never had to do it to that degree. But doing it is very, very boring and very, very time consuming. And it's very easy these days now, in particular, to get distracted because the world's quite a busy place. There's a lot going on. It's very easy to kind of lose focus, and then those human errors occur. The problem is with that is, one, that's then affected your data integrity, which is very key in a lot of projects, but also is from a perspective of how do you find back where that data error occurred, who caused that data error. The tracking and traceability of that is very difficult. You think about if you were doing this from a big bang approach and you were trying to do 300-400 projects, that would not be a viable way of doing this. You couldn't necessarily employ an army of people to sit there and do data entry all night. And if you could, it would certainly be less cost effective and less secure, and also less from a data integrity standpoint than doing it with tooling. So it speeds up that transfer, and it also maintains that data quality. So as long as the mapping is done correctly, you are taking the metadata from A and putting it to B. The checksum and balances are done on both. There's validation across those data sets. So in a lot of cases, obviously they're all encrypted in transit as well. So the beauty of it is if you take data A and move it to data B, that integrity is maintained, but there's also a validation to ensure that what you now see at data B is the same as at data A. Imagine doing that manually. You'd have to get somebody independent from yourself to go and manually check every single one of those. So it shouldn't be significant tooling, for example. Now, there are a couple of tools, so we always recommend a couple. So we work with Project Data Suite. We work with them for many years now. They offer some great tooling that does a couple of things. One of them is that kind of migration, but it also gives you like backup approaches. And we also work with the likes of FluidBooks Pro. So both of those absolutely work from a project standpoint. We generally use those a lot when we're going from somewhere like Project Online to what was Project for the Web, now Microsoft Planner Premium. But either of those tools would absolutely meet 99% of everybody's needs. Now, that's the key thing, is I could sit here and tell you what is the best tool. And I always laugh when I see these websites to say, what are the top 5 best tools for data migration for projects? Well, whose opinion is that? Is that potentially right for your organization as well? And I think that's one of the biggest things that, always worries me, where people survey very different products and they kind of go, right, yes, well, Gartner says it's the best performing project. It's one of those kind of trend setters. It's one of those kind of leading contenders in that space. But yes, for the majority of people, doesn't mean it meets your particular organizational needs. So I think that's the key thing, is although as software vendors will often tell you their product is the best, it might not be the best fit or suit or needs for your organization. So doing that kind of feature comparison and selecting the right tool for you is certainly one of the biggest advice I can give to anybody. Don't just go on the hype of the fact that somebody else has used it or somebody has told you that's the best tool. Always scout ahead and find out. Now, using tooling, I mentioned some of these already in passing, but minimizing that manual effort. Now, I could certainly tell you I would never, as a project manager, and I never have ever done a data migration manually, because I don't think, one, I could motivate people to do that manually. I think, two, I'd find it very difficult to justify from a cost efficiency point of view. But three, I would be absolutely petrified of the bottom two there with that human error and that data integrity. Not also these days when we've got larger regulations and legislations around kind of how data is handled, that now is become even more of a minefield that I wouldn't necessarily want to ever get into. You imagine doing a DPIA, so an assessment on basically how you're going to manage that private information. I don't think I could happily say that I'm going to get Jeff, for example, to go and migrate all of my data. It's not something that I would look at doing. So tooling has a key part in data migrations, mainly because of those three areas in particular. So moving on to what I like to call the kind of the painful section of it all is compliance. So from a data retention and compliance point of view, this has become more and more important over the years because obviously new legislations that have come in, and I'm just going to roll off a couple. So obviously we've had the Data Protection Act of 2018, which is obviously a key piece of legislation that governs the original processing of personal data in the UK. So that's one of them. We then obviously have GDPR. So GDPR again is another crucial thing to consider. So how we kind of manage that data, how we process it, how we transport it, that is very key. You still have some of these challenges with tools because you still have to go through that kind of DPIA assessment to understand how that data is managed, where that data is processed, how that data is then transported, that kind of thing. And again, a lot of those organizations have thought about it, got the right accreditations and gone through that process. But it's also how do you maintain and regulate that data? So understanding your data retention. Now, if we go back to that example I gave earlier, where they've got to keep some of their project information for a certain period of years. Now, I've come from organizations that have dealt with pension regulations, for example, and the regulations around pensions and maintaining data there is very different to that of normal legislation. So understanding the type of data you're managing and maintaining will also really massively impact how you retain that data, what kind of role classification you give it, how long you store it, and that kind of data subject as well. So again, classifying your data is massive. Now, for any of you that work in the public sector, obviously we also have the Freedom of Information Act that we need to be aware of. So if you're doing a project, for example, that has some kind of public interest, I certainly have seen examples of this in the past. I've done a lot of stuff for public sectors over my many years in IT. But people will sometimes put a subject access request in or put a request in for a freedom of information request for certain information that you may have delivered on that project. Now, the actual maintaining of that data, again, has different legislation. So obviously, from a transparency and accountability point of view, how you maintain and regulate that data is very different. So if you think about all of those now and think back to what I said about how you process that from a manual standpoint, if you ever deal with any of that kind of information, that's why manual processing generally now is very much not looked at as an industry standard. So it's just something to be aware of. But identifying good strategies to kind of maintain and regulate that is key. So one of the biggest strategies is around that historical data. So data encryption is probably the biggest one. How do we maintain and encrypt that data? One, in REST, so it's sitting, let's say in SharePoint, for example, is that data maintained at REST? How is it kind of encrypted? What layers of encryption does it have? But if I'm transporting that with anybody, so if we think back to the kind of tooling that we were talking about, how is that encrypted in transit? Is there any kind of TLS, SSL certifications around that data? Is it protected? How does that kind of work? So in that transport layer, how is that data encrypted? Does it have public and private keys? How is that kind of processed? From an access control point of view, again, if it's kept as legacy data, who needs to access that? If it's something that you're maintaining from, let's say, a pensions regulation or something for the Freedom of Information Act that you necessarily need to keep hold of, does everybody in your organisation need to have access to that historical data? I can probably tell you now, that is absolutely not the case, and generally you'll have a process around how you manage that data. But the biggest thing in here is to kind of do those audits and do something like a data protection impact assessment. So I mentioned it earlier, the DPIA, is how you basically evaluate that data processing activities and the protection of mostly personal data, but making sure that you ensure that compliance with all of the data protection legislations that you may have to adhere to. And it can get very, very painful because if you're a multinational company, you've obviously got the likes of HIPAA, SOC, and all the others that may come into play as well. So just it's food for thought in that kind of area. So avoiding some of the common pitfalls. And this is more about the organisation. There's not a lot as individuals you may be able to impact this unless you work in the kind of data security and compliance areas, is the inadequate policies. Now, as you're doing a data migration, these are some of the questions you should be asking. If I'm going to maintain this data, even if you believe at the moment you've covered this off, if you're running a new project, is actually start to ask questions about what our current policy for data retention are. Now, hopefully you should all know, because I'm sure you all go through training. But reality is it's something, again, that sometimes can be forgotten. So having those kind of processes in place. If I went through the number of times over the years where generally when you're running a project, somebody all of a sudden thinks from a perspective of, oh, hang on a minute, what do security and compliance need to know? You're bringing in a new tool, you're going to maintain historical data. Get them involved early, understand what the policies are, and understand your data management. So taking those kind of proactive steps as you're going to embark on that migration journey is key to understanding those requirements. But also future-proof yourself. So this isn't just about data, but this is actually just good advice anyway. Is to obviously just do regular data reviews. So we mentioned earlier that you do have assessments that you can carry out. A lot of companies obviously have to go through ISO audits on a regular basis, but actually understanding and reviewing those data reviews on a regular basis is key to make sure that you're maintaining that data. And also from a perspective of, if you've got retention policies, what happens at the end of that retention policy? Is it a case you can now destroy that data? Do you have to go through some kind of review before that data is removed? Also updating your governance policies. Now, policies change all the time. So that's something to be aware of. Things change, I know, in the financial sector and particularly in the pension sector a lot. That changes on a very, very regular basis. So are your current data policies for maintaining that still up to date? And as I touched on it earlier, is that kind of staff training point. That is, like I mentioned a few times now, is one of the biggest areas with data policies, data leaks, that kind of thing, is making sure your staff are trained in how to handle data correctly. Just because they're dealing with project data, for example, in a migration, doesn't necessarily mean they should have access to some of that data. And if they feel that they've got access to data, they shouldn't have what is a reporting process to go through. So just some other areas to consider. But also adopting emerging technology. Now, cloud computing, I'm sure a lot of you have already embarked on. Obviously, we're a Microsoft partner, so we utilize the likes of 365, Entra, Azure, that kind of platform is pretty much prevalent. I've worked in industries where I've moved from an on-premise solution to cloud computing. That does offer a lot of flexibility, but it also does de-risk some of that strategy. Although as an organization, you are still responsible for your data, having, you know, the likes of Microsoft or someone look after your data gives you a little bit more confidence around how that's securely stored, how it's managed, that kind of thing, because you've got somewhere you can go and get industry best practice regulations and maintenance on. AI, and I promise there isn't a slide these days that doesn't mention artificial intelligence. AI is playing a massive part in everything now. So if you think about just all of this process, so from a migration standpoint, from a data retention standpoint, how can AI help? Now, there's a lot of things it can do, but it can also be a hindrance. If you think about how AI can interact with your data, again, that's something you need to consider, because if you're maintaining historical data, does AI need to access that? Or maybe you allow AI to access that and not humans, so that if you need to find information for a freedom of information request, you can ask Copilot to do it, but a human wouldn't necessarily have access to that data directly. So there's a couple of ways that can be utilized. But also from a standpoint of big data. So obviously data in this day and age is probably one of the biggest commodities. A lot of organizations will go out and sell it, they shouldn't. But data for us is pretty much our driver on everything. So if you think about just from a standpoint of the migration, understanding what was successful with that migration, how that migration was effective. If you were going to do a cost impact analysis on doing it manually and against using a tooling, this would be a great way to showcase that. So you've got reports that can basically show you how effective that was and how efficient that was against how long it would have taken an individual to do it. From a forecast and an actual standpoint is really powerful. but also how you're maintaining that data and how you're cleansing it on a regular basis. Because migration isn't necessarily just a one-time process. You might be backing that up to a third party. That in itself is a data sync or a data migration, albeit it's just taking a snapshot in time. So again, it's quite a common process that happens more than people think. Generally, people think of a migration as just a one-time exchange. Obviously, you are, in the long term, you are moving it, but you are doing the kind of migration strategies on a regular basis. So just something to be aware of. But equipping yourself as well for that kind of digital transformation. So one is to do a lot of investment in your kind of training and to kind of go through that process, but also is utilizing modern tools. So again, I mentioned about utilizing stuff that has AI is key. If you've got something that's got AI efficiencies built into it now, I'll be honest with you, with the likes of how AI is moving forward these days, it's going to make like the world of automation and like that robotic process automation really, really powerful. I spoke about it many years ago when I worked in a technology role about how RPA would change the world. That was a good 10 years ago. We're now starting to finally see the reality of that. Now AI and machine learning has kind of leveraged those tooling and made it more powerful. But also thinking about that data storage. Now, if you're maintaining a large number of data, so from a historical project point of view, for example, where is that data stored? Does it need to be in what we call warm storage, so it's something that's easily accessible, or could it be put in a cold storage location, which is very secure? It's only spun up if you ever need it, that kind of thing. I've worked with organizations in the past where I actually did the migration, and from our standpoint, we had to maintain some really old pension information, and we kept it in a cold storage because basically if we ever had any requests to go and do that, there was a process behind the scenes that would spin up that storage. So the storage was never accessible unless it needed to be, but we had an index of all the data that was maintained in there. So having different flexible storage options is key, but also maintaining it in more than one place as well is definitely a key consideration. So from a conclusion standpoint, data migrations are important. Obviously, from its own definition, it's the transfer of information between systems, ensuring that data integrity and accessibility. We need to obviously understand your data retention for projects, and that can vary from project to project, what you're delivering, if you're delivering it internally, externally, is there third party involved, is there PPI involved, that kind of thing, and understanding that. But also from a best practice and the strategies around it is understanding and defining your own. I think as an organisation, it's one thing that I don't see enough organisations do is actually building and maintaining their own strategy for data migration. So forget just about projects. Think about as a whole, how would you go about leveraging your data migration strategy? But then leveraging that automation. I said that is one of the key things now that a lot of organisations will look at is how you can maintain and utilise automation. Automation is king. It makes our life easier. Hopefully one day I can get AI to completely present this webinar for me and I can just sit and have a nice cup of tea. But that would be an amazing kind of step to go on. And the world is not a million miles from doing that. I promise you I'm not AI. So that's just a conclusion point from us. Just a little bit about CPS. If you haven't dealt with us previously, we are a Microsoft partner. We do have many partner alignments with Microsoft. You'll probably see from the background some of the awards and stuff in the past. If you haven't worked with us, I've seen some of the attendees today, some of them we definitely have worked with previously, but you haven't worked with us or you want to understand a little bit more about how you go about doing project data migrations because you may have deployed it all and then suddenly thought, right, I need to now look at how I bring that stuff in.